A locked room, a missing key, and a truth buried in silence. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. I love seeing our mystery circle grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your comments make this journey unforgettable. Now, let's unlock the hidden key mystery. The annual St. Mary Mead summer fete had begun in the most ordinary of ways, with bunting strung between the lime trees on the village green, stalls laden with jam jars and knitted socks, and the faint, sweet strains of the church organ drifting out of the open doors of St. Peter's. Children darted between the trestle tables, sticky with toffee apples, while their mothers lingered over raffles and gossip. It was a picture of timeless English cheer, the sort that looked to a casual eye immune to disruption. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat serenely near the tea tent, her hands folded over her handbag, observing the proceedings with the same quiet interest she might give to a game of chess. She smiled at Mrs. Bantry's exuberant declarations about her roses, nodded to Colonel Melchett's booming laugh, and listened carefully as a gaggle of ladies speculated about the curate's new housekeeper. But the fete, as such events have a curious habit of doing, was about to turn. At precisely 3:30, just as the vicar prepared to announce the winner of the cake competition, a sharp cry rose from behind the jam store. The sound was strange, half gasp, half shriek, and drew every head round at once. There, amidst the tipped-over jars and spilled currant jelly, lay the figure of Mr. Harold Penrose, the solicitor from Much Benham, his face pale and still. A small brass key glinted oddly in the grass beside his open hand. The crowd surged, shocked whispers rippling like wind across a wheat field. "Good heavens, dead," gasped Mrs. Price Ridley. "Murder," whispered another, eyes wide with both fear and excitement. "Surely not here," muttered Colonel Melchett, though his jaw was set. Miss Marple did not move at once. Instead, she regarded the little brass key lying incongruously by the dead man's hand. A key, she reflected, always unlocked something. The question was what or whom it was meant to open. And in that moment, before the police had even arrived, before anyone thought to clear the crowd or send for a doctor, Miss Marple quietly understood that the peaceful fabric of St. Mary Mead had just been torn open, and the threads would lead, if one knew how to follow them, to a most uncomfortable truth. The silence that followed Mr. Penrose's collapse was almost as shocking as the cry itself. It seemed as though the entire fate held its breath, suspended between disbelief and dawning comprehension. A few seconds passed before Mrs. Bantry, her wide-brimmed hat askew from jostling forward, exclaimed in horror, "Someone fetch Dr. Haydock at once!" Her voice broke the paralysis, and immediately the villagers began to move in a flurry of panic and purpose. Young Tom Sims, the butcher's boy, was dispatched at a run towards the doctor's surgery, while others crowded closer, despite the colonel's stern warnings to step back. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, her mild blue eyes observing with the faintest furrow of concern at the corner of her brow. Then, with unhurried grace, she rose and made her way towards the scene. By the time she arrived, a small knot of villagers had gathered round the solicitor's body, some whispering in shocked tones, others craning for a better view with the grim curiosity of those unused to tragedy, but secretly fascinated by it. Mr. Penrose lay supine upon the grass, his neat grey suit darkened at the elbow, where a jar of strawberry preserve had spilled upon it. His spectacles had fallen askew, one lens cracked against the hard earth, and that curious brass key still gleamed at his side, untouched and ignored by all save Miss Marple. She noted how its polished surface caught the sunlight, how strangely out of place it looked upon the village green. Dr. Haydock arrived briskly within minutes, his bag swinging, his manner all efficiency. He bent over the body, pressed 2 fingers against the lifeless throat, and after only the briefest examination shook his head gravely. "He's gone," he pronounced, rising with an air of finality. "Dead before he hit the ground, I should say." Gasps and murmurs erupted. Mrs. Price Ridley clasped her hands dramatically against her bosom. "A seizure, surely," she declared, in tones that hoped to quell the swelling suspicion already forming in the crowd. The man was a solicitor. All that paperwork, so unhealthy. It must have been his heart. Colonel Melchett, who had assumed his customary air of authority, cleared his throat. "We shall not speculate," he said firmly, though his sharp glance suggested he himself had already begun to do so. "Sergeant Harper will arrive shortly to see to matters." Yet speculation was the lifeblood of St. Mary Mead, and no stern injunction could suppress it. Even as Dr. Haydock covered the body with a hastily produced picnic blanket, the villagers began to murmur among themselves, piecing together fragments of rumor, gossip, and conjecture. "It was the heat," said Mrs. Bantry, though her voice trembled with doubt. "The poor man looked flushed earlier." "Heat?" "Poppycock," countered Mr. Ellison, the retired schoolmaster, with a certain relish. "He was arguing with Mr. Latham by the Skittles alley not 20 minutes ago. Sharp words, I heard them myself." "Over business, no doubt," added Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on knowing more than was seemly. "Mr. Penrose had the unpleasant duty of managing certain wills and mortgages, I gather. People seldom thank a solicitor." Miss Marple, standing slightly apart from the group, listened to these theories with her usual quiet patience. To anyone else, her expression might have seemed absent-minded, but those who knew her well would have recognized the faint gleam of thought behind her gentle eyes. She said nothing of her own observations, merely tucking her gloves neatly into her handbag. When Sergeant Harper arrived, puffing and red-faced, he was greeted by Colonel Melchett, who wasted no time in assuming command. "Secure the area, Harper," he instructed. "Take down names, find out who last saw the man alive, and make certain nothing is disturbed." Harper nodded, already flustered by the task of dispersing the crowd. Yet even as he attempted to assert order, gossip surged like a restless tide, carrying whispers of motives, quarrels, and long-held grievances. The villagers, though outwardly horrified, couldn't help the secret thrill of drama intruding upon their humdrum lives. Miss Marple moved quietly among them, neither pushing forward nor lingering behind. She overheard Mrs. Bantry recounting how Mr. Penrose had seemed distracted when she had spoken to him earlier about a charity subscription. "He wasn't listening at all," she said with some indignation. "Kept glancing about, as if expecting someone." Nearby, young Lydia Cockerell whispered to her friend that she had seen Mr. Penrose slip an envelope into his pocket before visiting the refreshment tent. "Looked important, it did," she confided, her eyes wide with the self-importance of one who has glimpsed a secret. Miss Marple tucked these morsels away in the neat filing system of her mind, where every detail, however trivial, was kept for later consideration. She knew from long experience that human beings revealed themselves in their smallest gestures, and that truth was often hidden amidst the very chatter that others dismissed as nonsense. As the body was carried away under the doctor's supervision, the fate began to unravel into disorder. The raffles were abandoned, the games forgotten. Mothers gathered their children and spoke in hushed tones, while the men formed knots of serious discussion, shaking their heads gravely. Miss Marple returned to her seat by the tea-tent, accepting a cup from the flustered vicar's wife, who insisted weakly that everyone ought to have something warm to settle their nerves. She sipped quietly, watching as Sergeant Harper questioned various witnesses in a manner both earnest and clumsy. It was clear he sought the obvious answer, the convenient explanation. And, indeed, it was not long before a name began to circulate with insistent regularity. Mr. Latham, the estate manager, who had been seen quarrelling with Penrose earlier that afternoon. "There you are," Mrs. Price Ridley declared with satisfaction, as though she herself had solved the matter. "Quarrels, tempers, and now this. I should not be surprised if it were murder after all. If it were murder." Miss Marple set her teacup down, her expression one of mild concern. Murder, she thought, was an ugly word to fling so carelessly. And yet, her eyes drifted again to the memory of that brass key, so innocently overlooked by all. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the villagers were right in their suspicions or whether, as so often happened, the truth lay not in the loud quarrels and obvious tempers, but in something smaller, subtler, and far more revealing. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the green. The fete, once so lively, dissolved into uneasy silence as people drifted homeward, each carrying their own version of the tragedy. Behind their shutters, they would whisper and speculate deep into the night, weaving stories around the dead solicitor and the mysterious brass key. And in one quiet parlour on the high street, Miss Marple would sit by her lamp, knitting needles clicking steadily, her thoughts moving as nimbly as her hands. She knew, as surely as she knew the turning of the seasons, that death in St. Mary Mead was never as simple as it seemed. The key would unlock more than a door. It would open secrets long buried beneath the polite veneer of village life. That evening the village lay unusually hushed beneath a sky streaked with lavender and rose. Ordinarily, the end of the fete would have left St. Mary Mead buzzing with cheerful recollections of games won and cakes tasted, but now there was only unease, a subdued murmur at cottage doors and a restless glint in the eyes of those who gathered at their hearths. Word of Harold Penrose's sudden collapse had spread from house to house with the speed of wildfire, and every retelling grew slightly more dramatic than the last. By nightfall, it had been firmly decided among the villagers that the solicitor had not merely succumbed to natural causes, but had met with foul play. In the parlour of the Blue Boar Inn, a cluster of men nursed their ales with unusual gravity. "Mark my words," said old Mr. Pritchard, leaning forward with a conspiratorial air. "Penrose knew something he shouldn't. That man had secrets stuffed in his briefcase like herrings in a barrel. He was bound to catch up with him." "Rubbish," scoffed Mr. Ellison, though his eyes gleamed with interest. "The man had enemies, certainly, most lawyers do, but murder in St. Mary Mead, it doesn't bear thinking of, yet think of it they all did, each man secretly recalling times when Penrose's cold efficiency had pricked their pride or threatened their pockets. Meanwhile, in sitting rooms and kitchens, the women of the village speculated with equal fervour. Mrs. Bantry confided to her husband that she had always suspected Penrose of being a rather sly sort, while Mrs. Price Ridley insisted that nothing good ever came of solicitors meddling in family affairs. She recounted with relish the tale of a widow in Much Benham who had lost her house due to Penrose's strict handling of a debt. "Enemies everywhere, I dare say," she concluded with grim satisfaction. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly in her neat little cottage on the high street, her knitting needles clicking softly in the lamplight. Her mind replayed the events of the day with a clarity that allowed her to place each word, each gesture in its proper place. She thought of Mr. Latham's quarrel with Penrose, of Lydia Cockerell's whispered claim about the envelope, of the distracted manner with which Penrose had scanned the crowd before his death. Above all, she thought of the small brass key lying so innocently at his side, a detail already dismissed by most as mere accident. But Miss Marple knew there were no accidents, not truly. Things had a way of placing themselves exactly where human hands or intentions had left them. The following morning dawned bright and deceptively peaceful, with birds singing as though tragedy had no place in their world. Yet by the time the church bell tolled 9, the village was once again buzzing with talk. Sergeant Harper had spent the early hours questioning householders, and his inquiries had only fanned the flames of gossip. The consensus among many was that Mr. Latham, the estate manager, had both motive and opportunity. After all, several villagers recalled the quarrel near the Skittles alley, and it was common knowledge that Penrose had recently been involved in matters concerning the ownership of land managed by Latham. At the post office, Mrs. Bickford whispered to the postmistress that she had overheard Harper asking directly whether Latham had been seen after the argument. "Mark me, he'll be arrested by tea time," she predicted with a little nod, as though pleased at her own foresight. But Miss Marple, standing quietly in the queue behind her, gave only the faintest smile. She had seen the look on Latham's face at the fete. Anger, yes, but of the open, blustering sort, not the calculated malice that brought death. Still, she would not voice such thoughts aloud. The police, she knew, liked to pursue the obvious first, and it was seldom wise to dissuade them too early. Later that day, Colonel Melchett himself called upon her, not because he required her assistance, he never admitted that, but because, as he put it, a steady, sensible head was useful in troubled times. Over tea and seed cake in her parlour, he outlined the situation with brisk precision. Penrose was not a popular fellow, he said. Handled unpleasant business, foreclosures, contested wills. We've a dozen folk who might have wished him harm. But Latham stands out. They argued, witnesses heard it, and Penrose was found dead within the hour. Dr. Haydock is cautious, says it may have been the heart, but he cannot rule out poison. The fellow's face was pale, lips faintly bluish. Suggestive, wouldn't you say? Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "I believe," she said in her gentle, musing way, "that anger often makes itself felt in words and gestures, Colonel, but it is resentment that settles quietly, deep in the heart. Resentment waits and watches and chooses its moment." She paused to adjust her spectacles, as if the matter were of little importance. I should not be too hasty in supposing Mr. Latham's temper to be proof of guilt. A loud quarrel may be no more than a safety valve. Far more dangerous, I have always found, are those who quarrel silently. Melchett frowned, clearly uneasy with her cryptic observation, but he did not press the point. He knew from past encounters that Miss Marple often spoke in parables only to be proven right in the end. Still, he left her cottage muttering that evidence, not musings, would solve the case. That evening, the inquest was announced for the following day. Villagers speculated eagerly about what would be revealed, whether the doctor would declare natural causes, or whether darker suspicions would be confirmed. Yet beneath all the gossip lay a current of unease, for if Penrose had indeed been murdered, then the killer still walked among them, passing unnoticed through their lanes and hedgerows, sharing their markets and their church pews. The thought sent shivers through even the most sceptical hearts. Miss Marple, meanwhile, walked in her garden at dusk, the scent of roses heavy in the air. She considered the solicitor's life as one might examine the stitching on a piece of embroidery, looking for a loose thread that explained the flaw. Penrose had enemies, yes, but enemies of a general kind, men and women who resented his duties but had little to gain by his death. A murder, she knew, was seldom committed for dislike alone. There was always something more, something to be gained or something to be protected. Her eyes fell upon the little brass key she had asked Harper, quite innocently, if she might keep safe until claimed. He had agreed, grateful for her offer to ensure it was not lost among the jumble of evidence. She held it now in her hand, its cool weight oddly significant. A key to what? A drawer, a box, perhaps even a safe deposit? And why had it been in Penrose's hand at all, unless he had meant to use it, or unless someone had placed it there for others to find? The faintest smile touched her lips, though it did not reach her eyes. She had once remarked to the vicar that human nature was much the same in a village as in the wider world. One need only pay attention to the small patterns, the trifling habits, and the truth would reveal itself. Now, as the shadows lengthened across her garden, she sensed that the truth about Harold Penrose's death lay not in the obvious quarrels or the loud suspicions, but in something smaller, hidden beneath the folds of ordinary life, waiting to be uncovered. And as the first stars pierced the velvet sky, Miss Marple returned indoors, resolved to knit her way patiently through the tangled threads of human motive until the pattern emerged, clear and undeniable. Somewhere in the village, someone carried the weight of a secret, and she would find it. The morning of the inquest arrived crisp and clear, with a faint mist rising over the meadows and the church bells striking 9 with solemn insistence. The villagers, who prided themselves on restraint in ordinary circumstances, found themselves drawn irresistibly toward the small courthouse in Much Benham where proceedings were to be held. It was not merely curiosity, though that was present in abundance, but a sense that the affair had cast a shadow over their community, one which only the pronouncement of the coroner could begin to lift. Miss Marple took her place quietly among the rows of wooden benches, her pale blue eyes mild and thoughtful, her knitting discreetly tucked away in the capacious bag at her side. She had chosen a seat neither at the front nor the back, but in that middle ground where she could observe both the witnesses and the reactions of her fellow villagers. For she knew, as only she could, that what people said under oath was one thing, but what they betrayed by expression, fidget, or sudden glance was quite another. The coroner, a stout, ruddy-faced man with a voice inclined to pomposity, called the room to order and began the solemn recitation of the circumstances. Harold Penrose, solicitor of Much Benham, had collapsed suddenly at the St. Mary Mead fete. Medical examination, he declared, could not confirm a natural cause. Dr. Haydock, summoned as witness, explained in his brisk and rather irritable fashion that while the heart was always a possibility in men of Penrose's age, he had been disturbed by certain discolorations about the lips and fingernails. I should not like to say poison without further tests, he concluded, but I do not rule it out either. A murmur swept the room, quelled only by the coroner's gavel. Poison, that whisper of malignancy, carried with it a sinister fascination. It was an invisible weapon, cowardly yet clever, and in the village imagination it immediately conjured visions of teacups laced with powders, of meals served with hidden malice. The next witness called was Mr. Latham, the estate manager whose quarrel with Penrose had already made him the prime suspect in the minds of many. He strode forward stiffly, his large frame uncomfortably squeezed into his best jacket, his jaw set in stubborn lines. Under questioning, he admitted readily that he had argued with Penrose about the boundaries of land recently sold to a developer. So he was obstinate, Latham said gruffly. He had the law on his side and he knew it. I lost my temper. Words were exchanged. But I would not harm him, whatever folk may think. His declaration was met with skeptical mutters from the benches. The coroner pressed him further, but Latham remained firm. He had left the Fete shortly after the quarrel, he said, and had been seen in conversation with Mr. Green, the grocer, near the poultry tent at the time of Penrose's collapse. Green, called to verify, gave reluctant confirmation, though in a tone that suggested he disliked being placed between two men of authority. Miss Marple watched it all without change of expression, though she noted the quick dart of Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes as she leaned to whisper to her neighbour, and the way Lydia Cockerill, seated with her mother, bit her lip as though restraining some comment. These small observations, seemingly trivial, Miss Marple stored away as carefully as she did her skeins of wool. Next came testimony regarding Penrose's possessions. Sergeant Harper produced the contents of the solicitor's pockets: a watch, a wallet with several notes, a handkerchief, and a sealed envelope bearing no name. And, of course, the brass key. The sergeant explained in his halting manner that the key did not appear to fit any of the solicitor's office locks, nor his home in Much Benham. "We are making inquiries," he said, glancing uncertainly at the coroner. The coroner examined the key with interest but could draw no conclusion. "It may be of significance," he allowed, "or merely a trifle. Further investigation will reveal the truth." When the coroner finally called for any additional witnesses who had observed the deceased on the day in question, Lydia Cockerill surprised many by standing, cheeks flushed but voice steady. She described seeing Penrose slip the mysterious envelope into his pocket before visiting the refreshment tent. "He looked worried," she added in a whisper that carried none the less to every corner of the room, "as though he expected something dreadful." A ripple of sensation passed through the benches. The coroner frowned and ordered the envelope opened at once. Its contents proved to be a single folded sheet, on which were written a few cryptic words: "The key is everything, guard it well." The atmosphere in the courtroom changed instantly, charged with new speculation. A key to what? And who had written such a message? Miss Marple did not stir, though inwardly she acknowledged the cleverness of such a device. She observed how Mrs. Bantry raised her eyebrows in astonishment, how Colonel Melchett's mouth tightened in disapproval at the theatrics, and how young Lydia looked half proud, half terrified to have been the bearer of such information. In the end, the coroner adjourned with an open verdict: death in suspicious circumstances, pending further investigation. It satisfied no one, least of all the villagers, who left the courthouse in clusters, buzzing with theories as bees swarm around a hive. Some insisted that the note proved blackmail. Others whispered of secret affairs or lost inheritances. Each theory grew more elaborate as it was exchanged, embroidered with personal bias and old grudges. As Miss Marple stepped out into the bright noon sunlight, Mrs. Bantry joined her with eager energy. "My dear Jane, isn't it perfectly extraordinary? A mysterious key, a cryptic note. Why, it's like one of those detective novels Arthur so enjoys. What can it mean, do you suppose?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It often happens, dear Dolly," she said mildly, "that things which appear most dramatic prove in the end to be quite simple. Human nature is not, after all, a very complicated affair. One must merely look in the right direction." Her friend sighed, unsatisfied by such understatement, and turned instead to share her excitement with Mrs. Price Ridley, who was already expounding on the certainty of foul play. But Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts moving with quiet precision. A quarrel too convenient, a key too deliberate, a note too pointedly mysterious. These things, she felt, were pieces of a puzzle, yes, but perhaps not the puzzle most of the villagers imagined. She knew too well how often appearances were designed to deceive, and how readily people grasped at the obvious, while the truth lay in the background, waiting for the one observer who noticed what others did not. That evening, as she resumed her knitting by lamplight, the brass key lay upon the table before her. Its dull gleam caught the glow of the flame, and she studied it with the same patient attention she gave to the slow unfolding of her wool. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the lock awaited its key. Somewhere in the web of gossip and half-truths, the motive revealed itself. And until it did, Miss Marple would watch and listen, and wait, quiet as ever, and underestimated by all save the one who had reason to fear her most. The day after the inquest, the village settled into a strained quiet, though the outward appearance of normality was carefully preserved. Curtains were drawn back as usual, the milk delivered at doorsteps, the postman making his familiar rounds, yet beneath the polite greetings and nods of civility, conversations broke into hurried whispers the moment backs were turned. Suspicion clung to the air, invisible yet palpable, and it seemed to Miss Marple as she walked to the grocer's that morning that every face bore traces of unease, of curiosity or of calculation. At the shop, Mrs. Price Ridley held forth as though she alone had the coroner's authority. "You will see," she declared in a voice meant to be overheard, "that note proves everything." Blackmail, naturally. Penrose must have been threatening someone with exposure. What else could "guard it well" mean? Why, I should not be surprised if half the village had reason to wish him silenced. Mr. Green, who was measuring out sugar behind the counter, grunted without comment. Lydia Cockerell, standing nearby, lowered her eyes and pretended to examine a rack of toffees, though the flush in her cheeks betrayed her awareness of being once again the subject of conversation. Miss Marple, placing her order for a modest quantity of flour, offered a gentle remark that seemed nothing more than idle chatter. "People are sometimes very dramatic in their expressions," she observed. "I recall once a maid who always left notes saying 'don't forget,' and invariably it was something she had already forgotten herself. One mustn't assume importance merely because words appear so solemn." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed, unconvinced, and swept from the shop with her purchases, leaving Lydia to look after her with a mixture of resentment and relief. Miss Marple gave the girl a kindly nod before leaving, but she tucked the observation away. Lydia had known more than she had said at the inquest. That much was certain. By afternoon, the official inquiry had moved to Much Benham, with Sergeant Harper reporting to Colonel Melchett. It was already clear that the brass key remained an enigma. None of the locks at Penrose's home or office admitted it. The solicitor's clerks, questioned at length, claimed no knowledge of any private box or drawer that might fit it. One suggested a bank deposit box, but no record of such existed under Penrose's name. Miss Marple, walking back from the vicarage after tea with Mrs. Clement, allowed herself a moment's reflection by the churchyard gate. The note, its melodramatic wording, its vagueness, did not strike her as something a cautious solicitor like Penrose would have penned himself. And yet he had carried it, folded carefully as though its significance had been impressed upon him. She thought of men she had known in her long years, bankers, clerks, husbands with something to conceal, and she recognized the look Lydia had described, the anxious scanning of a crowd, the worried glance about. Penrose had been a man expecting danger, not merely suffering from heat or ill health. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected caller. It was Mrs. Bantry, still flushed with curiosity, who sank into the armchair by the fire and launched at once into the matter. "Jane, I must confess I am quite consumed with this business. Everyone says Latham is guilty, but you know how Arthur is. He insists it is too simple, too obvious, and truly I feel there is more in it, that key. My dear, what can it possibly unlock?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking as she continued her knitting. "It will unlock precisely what it was intended to unlock," she said mildly. "The question is rather who wanted it and why. A key is not valuable in itself. It is only as valuable as what it gives access to. And people are very revealing, you know, in how they respond to something they believe will expose them." Mrs. Bantry shivered, half with excitement and half with the thrill of mystery. "You sound as though you already know more than you let on." But Miss Marple only shook her head gently. "One mustn't hurry, Dolly. Truth, like jam, has a way of coming to the surface if you leave it to settle, and if you stir too much it becomes cloudy." The following morning brought fresh stirrings. Word spread that a clerk from Penrose's office had disclosed a troubling fact. A will recently drawn up under Penrose's supervision had gone missing. The will concerned none other than old Mrs. Aldrington of Much Benham, a wealthy widow whose fortune was the subject of much speculation. She had died only a fortnight ago, and her estate was considerable. Rumour had it that Penrose had confided in a colleague that the terms of the will would cause a sensation, Now the document could not be found. This revelation electrified the village. Was the missing will connected to the brass key? Was it hidden in a locked box, perhaps, one to which only Penrose had access? And had he been killed to prevent its discovery? The theories multiplied with each retelling, and soon everyone spoke as though the matter were already settled. Penrose had been murdered to conceal the will. Colonel Melchett, exasperated by the growing clamour, paid another visit to Miss Marple, half in search of calm counsel, half to test her reaction. "The thing's a mess, Miss Marple," he admitted, pacing her sitting room with military briskness. "The key, the missing will, the note. It all points to conspiracy. Someone stood to gain from Mrs. Aldrington's estate. And if Penrose was guarding that secret, it may have cost him his life." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with an expression of innocent inquiry. "You think, then, that the will must have been taken deliberately? That it was not merely misplaced?" "Certainly I do," Melchett said with conviction. "And the key must be connected. The simplest explanation is often the truest, Miss Marple. Someone wanted that will, and Penrose stood in the way." She nodded gently, as though considering his words with due respect. But inwardly she reflected that the simplest explanation was sometimes no more than the most convenient. People leapt to it eagerly because it spared them the trouble of looking further. And yet Miss Marple had observed many times in her life that those who appeared to profit most obviously from misfortune were often the least likely to have engineered it. The true culprit usually hid behind such assumptions, shielded by the eagerness of others to believe the obvious. That evening, she took out the brass key once more, turning it slowly between her fingers. It was small, sturdy, with the faint patina of age. Not a door key, she judged, nor for a bank deposit box. Something domestic, perhaps, or personal. She thought of Mrs. Aldrington's great house, now empty save for servants, and wondered whether in some drawer or casket the missing will still lay hidden. But what held her thoughts most firmly was not the missing will itself, but the human reaction to its disappearance. People spoke of inheritance, of money, of gain. Yet she knew that wills revealed more than legacies. They revealed affections, betrayals, family secrets. A will could expose not only who would receive wealth, but who had been denied it, and in that denial lay the deepest motives of all. Miss Marple folded her knitting, set the key carefully back upon the table, and let the fire burn low as she prepared to retire. She did not yet have the answer, but she sensed she was drawing nearer. For the pattern was emerging, faintly but surely, and she knew, with that instinct born of long observation, that when the truth came into view, it would not be the quarrelsome estate manager, nor the gossip's chosen villain who stood revealed, but someone altogether less expected. The following day dawned with an air of unease, for it was announced that Colonel Melchett and Sergeant Harper would begin a thorough search of Penrose's office and residence. Word of the missing will had already woven itself tightly into village gossip, and by mid-morning, small clusters of villagers lingered outside shops and at garden gates, speculating on what might be discovered. Some were certain the will had been destroyed. Others whispered that it was concealed somewhere obvious, waiting to be uncovered with just the right key. The brass key, of course, remained the favourite subject, its mystery enlarged with every telling. Miss Marple, as ever, did not join in the excitement, though she listened with her usual unobtrusive attentiveness. After attending to her modest household chores, she paid a visit to Mrs. Bantry, who was in high spirits at the thought of fresh revelations. "They are searching his office even as we speak," she declared, settling into her chair with evident relish. "Arthur says it is only a matter of time before something of importance turns up. Really, Jane, one cannot help feeling that the whole matter centres upon Mrs. Aldrington's estate. Imagine so much money at stake, and the will conveniently vanished. It smacks of calculation." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. "Money," she said softly, "is a strong motive, Dolly, but it is not the only one. In my experience, people will commit dreadful acts for reasons far less grand. Hurt pride, jealousy, fear of exposure. One mustn't always assume the largest fortune is at the root of things." Mrs. Bantry laughed lightly, unconvinced but entertained, and the conversation turned to village trifles. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered. She could not help recalling the expression on Lydia Cockerell's face at the inquest, the mixture of fear and knowledge suppressed, and she felt certain the girl had more to tell. By afternoon, News of the search filtered through the village. The police had found nothing extraordinary in Penrose's office. Bundles of papers neatly tied, files arranged with legal precision, and no trace of the missing will. At his residence, likewise, the cupboards and drawers had yielded nothing of consequence. The brass key had been tried upon every lock without success. To the villagers, this seemed only to deepen the mystery. To Miss Marple, it confirmed her suspicion that the matter was more subtle than appearances suggested. Later that day, Sergeant Harper, flushed and harassed, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand. "Colonel thought it best to speak with you, ma'am," he said awkwardly. "We're at a dead end with this key. Doesn't fit a thing in the man's possession. Colonel says you've a knack for seeing what others don't. If you've an idea, well, it might be worth hearing." Miss Marple received him kindly, poured him a cup of tea and listened with her usual patience as he recounted the fruitless search. When he finished, she regarded him with gentle sympathy. "It may be, Sergeant, that you are looking in the wrong place. Keys are curious things. They do not always belong to the person who carries them. Sometimes they are entrusted, sometimes taken, sometimes kept as tokens of power over another. I should not be surprised if this little key has nothing to do with Mr. Penrose's house or office at all." Harper looked baffled, but grateful for her words, and departed with renewed determination, though without any clearer direction. Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes thoughtful. She knew that the answer would lie, as it always did, not in the obvious searches or the official inquiries, but in the quiet observations of human nature. That evening, as she walked home from evensong, she passed the Cockerill cottage. Lydia was standing at the gate, her eyes downcast, her hand twisting the edge of her shawl. Miss Marple paused, her manner so gentle that it invited confidence. "It has been a trying few days for you, my dear," she said softly. "You must not let the village chatter trouble you. People speak too freely when they are frightened. Lydia looked up quickly, her lips parting as though she might speak, then closed them again with a swallow. I only said what I saw," she murmured. "The envelope, I mean. I didn't want to make trouble." Miss Marple laid a kindly hand on her arm. "The truth, even in small things, never makes trouble for the one who speaks it, only for the one who hides it. Remember that, child." She left Lydia with a smile, but she carried away the impression of a girl burdened by something unsaid. A detail perhaps too small for the police to notice, but not too small for Miss Marple. The next day brought yet another development. Colonel Melchett called a meeting at the vicarage, attended by himself, Dr. Haydock, and a few selected villagers who had been closest to the scene. Miss Marple was included, naturally, for though the colonel never admitted to relying on her, he had long since learned the value of her presence. The discussion was brisk. Dr. Haydock revealed that further examination suggested poison of some kind was indeed likely, though he could not yet identify the substance. Melchett laid out the situation with soldierly precision. Penrose had been in possession of a cryptic note, a mysterious key, and perhaps knowledge of a missing will. He had been quarrelling with Latham, but others too might have had reason to wish him dead. As the colonel spoke, Miss Marple observed the faces around her. The vicar's wife nervous and fluttering, Mrs. Bantry eager and speculative, Harper stolid but perplexed. Each responded in their own way, yet it was Dr. Haydock's irritation that caught her attention. "We're chasing shadows," he said sharply. "A key that fits nothing, a note that could mean anything. What we need is solid evidence, not fancy." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled almost imperceptibly. "And yet," she said mildly, "it is often the things that seem fanciful which prove most true. I recall once a case of a servant girl accused of theft. She was seen near the cupboard where the money was kept, and all assumed her guilty. But the true thief was the mistress herself, who counted upon her servant's foolishness to deflect suspicion. The obvious is so often a little too obvious, don't you think?" Her words hung in the air, dismissed by some, pondered by others. But for Miss Marple, they were not mere anecdotes. They were the quiet laying of groundwork, the gentle nudging of thought toward the truth. She knew the murderer was listening too, perhaps even in that very room, and that sooner or later their mask would slip. As the meeting broke up, Miss Marple lingered behind, her gaze drifting once more to the small brass key resting in its envelope upon the table. She touched it lightly with one finger, her expression serene. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead there was a lock waiting for it, a lock that would open not just a drawer or a box, but the hidden heart of the mystery itself. Until then she would wait and watch, and trust in the patterns of human nature to reveal themselves as they always did. In the end, the days that followed the meeting at the vicarage brought no relief to the village. If anything, the mystery grew darker, for every answer seemed to open two fresh questions. The police continued their efforts with diligence, interviewing clerks, searching through papers, and attempting to trace the missing will. But their progress was halting, and rumors flourished in the void left by certainty. People grew uneasy in one another's presence, each suspecting his neighbor more than himself. Yet in the midst of it all, Miss Marple maintained her quiet composure, knitting steadily by her window, her ears open to the smallest scraps of gossip that drifted down the high street. One afternoon, as she sat with her tea tray laid neatly beside her, she received a visit from young Lydia Cockerill. The girl entered timidly, eyes wide with some inner turmoil, and sat perched on the edge of her chair. Miss Marple, who sensed the delicate balance of the moment, said nothing at first, but offered tea and waited with patient kindness. At last, Lydia spoke in a rush, as though fearing she might lose her courage if she delayed. I think I may have seen something else that day. At the fete, I mean. Only I wasn't sure it was important, and I didn't want to be laughed at." Miss Marple's needles stilled, though she did not look up. "Very often," she said gently, "the things that seem least important are the ones that matter most." "What was it, my dear?" Lydia twisted her handkerchief. "It was just before Mr. Penrose collapsed. I was near the jam stall and I saw him take out that envelope. But it wasn't only that. He looked at someone, looked straight at them as though he wanted to speak, but then he changed his mind. And then a moment later he was on the ground." Miss Marple's eyes lifted now, calm and searching. "And whom did he look at, child?" Lydia hesitated, then whispered, "Mrs. Price Ridley, I'm sure of it. She was standing by the scones watching him, and when he looked at her she turned away as though she hadn't noticed." The admission hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Miss Marple did not betray surprise, though inwardly she noted the significance at once. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been among the loudest to declare suspicion against Latham, who thrived on gossip and indignation, might well have more reason than most to divert attention. Yet Miss Marple knew too well that appearances could deceive, and Lydia's memory, though sincere, might not tell the whole story. "Thank you, my dear," she said softly, patting the girl's hand. "You have been very brave to speak. It may help more than you imagine." That evening, as the church bell tolled Compline, Miss Marple considered the matter deeply. If Penrose had indeed intended to approach Mrs. Price Ridley, why had he refrained? Was it fear of confrontation? Or had he realized in that instant that to reveal his knowledge would be dangerous? The note in his pocket, "The key is everything, guard it well," returned to her mind with fresh insistence. Could Mrs. Price Ridley have been connected to that mysterious warning? The next day, Colonel Melchett came to consult with Miss Marple once again, his manner brisk but harried. "We are no nearer, Miss Marple," he confessed, pacing her parlour with military impatience. "We've questioned everyone twice over. Nothing. The will is still missing, the key still unexplained. Harper is convinced Latham had the best motive, but we've no proof, and the man sticks to his story. It's dashed unsatisfactory." Miss Marple listened serenely, her hands folded in her lap. "It is curious," she murmured, "how very eager some people are to point suspicion elsewhere. One might almost say that the loudest voices are sometimes those most anxious to be unheard themselves." Melchett frowned. "You think someone's deliberately diverting us?" She gave her faint smile. "Human nature is very simple, Colonel. When one feels exposed, the first instinct is to draw attention away, often with unnecessary emphasis. I dare say you have seen it in military life. The soldier who protests too much when accused of a minor fault often has a larger one hidden." The colonel nodded reluctantly, for he could not deny the truth of the observation. He left, still muttering, but with a new line of thought impressed upon him. That evening brought yet another ripple of disturbance. Word reached the village that the missing will had surfaced, at least in part. A fragment of paper had been discovered among Penrose's files, torn from a larger document, bearing Mrs. Aldrington's signature. It proved nothing complete, but it confirmed beyond doubt that such a will had existed. The villagers seized upon the revelation with renewed vigor, each embellishing the story with conjecture. Some claimed the widow had left her fortune to a distant cousin. Others swore it must have gone to a servant. The only certainty was that the absence of the full document pointed to deliberate concealment. Miss Marple considered the news with calm interest. A torn page, carelessly left behind, struck her as suspiciously convenient. She knew from long acquaintance with deceit that people often planted just enough evidence to confirm a rumor while hiding the real truth. Someone wanted the village to believe the will was central, and perhaps it was, but Miss Marple's instinct told her there was another layer beneath. The following afternoon, she took a quiet stroll past the Cockerill cottage again. Noting how Lydia's stepmother, Mrs. Cockerill, watched her from the window with narrowed eyes. That lady had never been fond of Miss Marple's kindly interest in Lydia, preferring to keep the girl subdued and silent. The look in her eyes now, sharp, guarded, did not escape Miss Marple's notice, nor did the faint glimpse of a small locked casket upon a side table inside the parlour, just visible through the lace curtain when the sun struck the glass. She continued her walk without pause, but her thoughts lingered. A small casket, locked and private, was precisely the sort of place one might hide a document or an object of importance. And the brass key, so modest, so unyielding to other locks, might very well belong to just such a box. If so, the presence of that casket in the Cockerill household raised questions too significant to ignore. That night, as she sat once more by her fire, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare sigh. The threads were tightening. The missing will, the anxious Lydia, the evasions of Mrs. Price Ridley, the guarded behaviour of Mrs. Cockerill, all were pieces of a pattern. And though the picture was not yet complete, she felt the moment approaching when the true shape would emerge, and with it, the face of a murderer concealed beneath the familiar mask of village respectability. For now, she would continue to knit and to wait and to watch. The key lay on the table before her, gleaming faintly in the lamplight, a silent promise of revelation. And Jane Marple, who understood better than most that human nature always betrayed itself in the end, was content to let the pattern unfold, stitch by careful stitch. The morning after Miss Marple's quiet observation of the Cockerill parlour dawned grey and damp, with a fine drizzle settling over the village, muffling sound and keeping most folk indoors. Yet the hush in St. Mary Mead was no less charged with speculation. The discovery of the fragment of Mrs. Aldrington's will had stirred imaginations to fever pitch, and it seemed that every villager now felt personally invested in the outcome. Rumour suggested that the police would soon return to search not only Penrose's properties, but also those of anyone connected to him. The thought of such scrutiny made even the most innocent nervous, for everyone, Miss Marple knew, carried secrets of one kind or another. Miss Marple herself moved about her modest kitchen with unhurried grace, preparing a pot of porridge before setting her knitting neatly beside her chair. She was not given to dramatic displays, but her mind, quietly alert, continued to circle the question of the brass key and the significance of that small locked casket glimpsed in the Cockerill parlour. She was certain now that the two were linked, though how directly remained to be proven. What struck her most was not the presence of the box itself, but the manner in which Mrs. Cockerill had watched her. It was the look of someone guarding more than household possessions. By midday, the drizzle had lifted, and Miss Marple ventured into the village, where she soon encountered Mrs. Bantry emerging from the post office with her usual air of energetic curiosity. "Jane," she exclaimed, clutching her umbrella though it was no longer raining. "You won't believe the latest. They say Sergeant Harper is to search Latham's house again. Some are sure he has hidden the will there. Really, I almost pity the man. He may be hot-tempered, but I don't believe him clever enough for such concealment." Miss Marple gave her mild smile. "Cleverness, Dolly, is not always the deciding factor. People sometimes succeed in deception, not because they are clever, but because others are too ready to believe the first explanation offered. Still, I think poor Mr. Latham's pride may be his worst enemy, not his actions." Mrs. Bantry, though unconvinced, chattered on, but Miss Marple's attention was already elsewhere. As they passed the grocer's, Lydia emerged clutching a small parcel and casting quick, anxious glances about her. She started when she saw Miss Marple, but managed a timid smile. Miss Marple returned it with kindly warmth, noting how the girl's stepmother followed moments later, her eyes sharp and possessive. Mrs. Cockerill barely acknowledged them, but her tight-lipped expression only confirmed Miss Marple's sense that something within that household was being fiercely guarded. That evening, Colonel Melchett called again, this time in a decidedly irritable mood. He had spent the day following up false leads, and his patience was wearing thin. Dash it all, Miss Marple, we're going round in circles. The will may as well have vanished into thin air, and the key, curse the key, is still a mystery. Latham denies everything. Penrose's clerks are useless, and the villagers are gossiping themselves into hysteria. If I don't make an arrest soon, I'll have the chief constable breathing down my neck. Miss Marple listened with her usual placid air, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It is most trying for you, Colonel, she said gently. But you know one must often be patient with these things. The truth has a way of showing itself in the smallest details, details which may seem unimportant at first, but which, when placed in their proper pattern, reveal everything. Melchett made a frustrated sound. Yes, you always say that. But what pattern do you see in all this? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. I see that we are all looking in the wrong direction. The will is important, yes, but perhaps not in the way people think. A will reveals not only wealth, Colonel, but sentiment, whom one loved, whom one trusted, whom one wished to disinherit. And those are matters of the heart, which, I dare say, can provoke stronger passions than money itself. Melchett left unsatisfied, though her words lingered in his mind as she knew they would. That night, Miss Marple's thoughts returned again to Lydia. The girl's nervousness, her half-confession, her stepmother's sharp vigilance, these pointed to knowledge not yet shared. And Miss Marple had long observed that when the young were oppressed by secrets too heavy for them, they often betrayed themselves in small, unguarded ways. The opportunity came the next morning. Miss Marple encountered Lydia alone by the churchyard, the girl having slipped out early to gather flowers for the altar. She looked pale, as though burdened by restless nights, but her eyes brightened faintly at Miss Marple's gentle greeting. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, bending to inspect the roses Lydia carried, "these are very fine. But I wonder if you are not carrying a heavier burden than these flowers. It is not good for a young girl to bear secrets alone. They weigh too much, and sooner or later they slip." Lydia trembled, her lips parting as though to protest, then closing again. At last she whispered, "It isn't my secret, Miss Marple. It's hers. She keeps it locked away. And I'm frightened." Miss Marple's voice was as calm as ever, though her heart quickened. "And is it in the little box on the table, my dear?" Lydia's eyes widened with shock. She nodded, then quickly looked away, ashamed of her betrayal. "I shouldn't have said—" "Please don't tell her." Miss Marple patted her arm reassuringly. "I shall not betray you, child. But you have done the right thing. Sometimes truth must be brought to light, even if others try to bury it." By evening, news reached the village that Sergeant Harper intended to widen the scope of his search. He had received instructions to inspect not only Penrose's properties, but also those of anyone connected to Mrs. Aldrington's affairs. Miss Marple, hearing this from Mrs. Bantry, felt a quiet certainty settle within her. If the police came upon that casket in the Cockerill parlour, the truth might begin to emerge, though whether it would reveal itself plainly or in some more devious disguise remained to be seen. As she sat later in her quiet parlour, the brass key before her once more, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to thread together. Penrose had carried the key and the note, had looked toward Mrs. Price Ridley, had feared something. Lydia had seen more than she realized, and Mrs. Cockerill guarded her little box with the ferocity of one who feared discovery. And somewhere, woven among these threads, lay the hand of the murderer, subtle, deliberate, and so far concealed by the noisy speculations of others. The rain began again, pattering softly against the window. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her face serene, though her mind was as sharp as ever. She knew the moment was coming when the quiet mask of ordinary village life would crack, and the truth, long hidden, would step forth into the light. And when it did, she would be ready. The morning that followed was charged with anticipation. The news that Sergeant Harper had been authorized to extend his search beyond Penrose's immediate possessions spread quickly, and the villagers greeted it with a mixture of dread and excitement. Curtains twitched as Harper made his rounds, though he was polite and deliberate, explaining that his task was purely routine. Yet in St. Mary Mead, the word search was never taken lightly, for it implied hidden things might be uncovered, things that were better left undisturbed. Miss Marple watched events with her usual quiet interest. She knew the sergeant's path would inevitably take him to the Cockerill cottage. There, behind lace curtains and careful propriety, a secret was being kept, and secrets seldom survived official scrutiny. Still, she reflected, discovery was not always the same as revelation. People often contrived to twist what was found into a new veil of deception. The truth, she mused, depended not only on what one held in one's hands, but on whether one recognized it when it appeared. By late afternoon, the first murmurs began to ripple through the village. Harper had indeed found a locked casket in the Cockerill parlour, small and heavy, which Mrs. Cockerill had been reluctant to surrender. With some persuasion, and a stern reminder of his authority, he had carried it away to be examined under Colonel Melchett's supervision. Word of this spread before Harper himself returned, carried on the swift wings of gossip, until half the village knew every detail. It was said that Mrs. Cockerill had grown pale with fury, that Lydia had wept quietly in a corner, and that the sergeant, though polite, had been firm. Miss Marple, hearing this from Mrs. Bantry, nodded with the faintest of smiles. She suspected that the brass key would fit that very casket, though whether it would reveal the missing will or some other treasure remained to be seen. That evening, Melchett himself came grave and somewhat disconcerted. The box had indeed been opened with the brass key, and within had been found not only a copy of Mrs. Aldrington's will, but also several letters, private and damning. These letters suggested that Mrs. Cockerill had long harboured resentment against Penrose, who had, it seemed, been entrusted with knowledge of financial dealings less than proper. They revealed unpaid debts, sharp dealings, and one or two matters that might have ruined her reputation entirely had they become public. It looks dashed clear. Miss Marple, Melchett declared, pacing her parlour. Penrose had the goods on her. He carried the key, he carried the warning note. He must have threatened her, or she feared he would. She had motive in plenty to silence him. And the box in her possession. Well, it all fits. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her knitting. Yes, she said softly, it does fit. But sometimes, Colonel, things fit rather too neatly. One must always ask who benefits from such a fit. Melchett frowned, impatient with what he thought her evasions, but he did not press her. He knew from experience that Miss Marple rarely spoke without reason. The following day brought the arrest of Mrs. Cockerill. She protested violently, declaring her innocence, insisting that the will had been given to her for safekeeping and that she had no part in Penrose's death. Lydia, pale and trembling, could only stand by, unable to defend her stepmother, yet too frightened to speak against her. The village seized upon the arrest with relish, for nothing so delighted gossip as the downfall of one who had long carried herself with superiority. Yet Miss Marple was not satisfied. That evening, she sat by her fire, the lamplight soft on her thoughtful face, and turned over the matter once again. Mrs. Cockerill was certainly capable of deceit and secrecy, that much was plain. But murder, Miss Marple, who knew her neighbours as others knew their garden plots, doubted it. Her anger was sharp, her pride formidable, but hers was not the temperament to risk everything in so dangerous a way. More likely, Miss Marple thought, she was being used, her box and her secrets serving as a convenient shield for someone else. Her mind returned again to Lydia's whispered confession, to the way Penrose had looked toward Mrs. Price Ridley in his final moments, to the curious tone of the note he had carried. It was not a warning written by him, but to him, and whoever had sent it had known about the key. That suggested knowledge intimate enough to place the object with him, and urgent enough to cloak it in mystery. Mrs. Cockerill had kept the box, yes, but she had not written that note. Nor, Miss Marple thought, had she the subtlety to contrive such a scheme. The pattern was still incomplete, but its shape grew clearer. Penrose had been silenced not merely to conceal a will, but to protect a deeper secret, one tied to old grievances and resentments. And somewhere among the villagers who now whispered with relish of Mrs. Cockerill's disgrace, the true hand of guilt remained hidden. Miss Marple folded her knitting with precision, her eyes distant but keen. The time was fast approaching when she would draw the threads together. Already she felt the murderer tightening their own noose with every careless whisper, every misplaced accusation, and when the moment came, she would be ready to reveal not only the truth of the brass key, but the darker truth it had been meant to keep locked away. The day of Mrs. Cockerill's preliminary hearing arrived with the village gathered in subdued expectation. Though many had already judged her guilty in their private conversations, there lingered a restless undercurrent of doubt. Even those most eager for scandal could not fully reconcile the picture of the domineering but respectable woman with the act of slipping poison into a solicitor's tea. And beneath the surface, Lydia's pale face haunted more than one conscience, her frightened eyes speaking of something unspoken. Colonel Melchett, grim and businesslike, had done his duty, but he too was uneasy. He had seen guilt before, and this did not sit comfortably. It was Miss Marple, however, who appeared most serene, her expression mild as she requested a small gathering at the vicarage before the proceedings began. "It will do no harm," she had said, "to set things out clearly. Sometimes when all the threads are laid side by side, the pattern reveals itself." And so in the vicar's sitting room, the key figures were assembled: Colonel Melchett, Sergeant Harper, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Bantry, Lydia with her stepmother under guard, and, most notably, Mrs. Price Ridley, whose presence drew no special comment, for she had been among the loudest voices in village discussions from the start. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting in her lap, her voice gentle but firm as she began. "We have spoken much of wills, of quarrels, and of boxes locked and unlocked, and yet what has troubled me from the first was something quite small. A look. Mr. Penrose, in his last moments, looked directly at someone. He had the envelope in his hand, and though he fell before he could speak, his eyes spoke for him. Lydia, my dear, you said truly." He looked toward Mrs. Price Ridley. There was a stir in the room, a sharp indrawn breath, and Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened, colour rising to her cheeks. "Nonsense," she snapped. "I was merely nearby." The poor man was collapsing, not directing glances. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, then stilled. But he had reason, you see. For it was not Mrs. Cockerill who wrote that note, nor did she place the key in his keeping. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, she who feared exposure most keenly, who knew Penrose's habit of keeping incriminating letters in his files. She sought to mislead him, to frighten him perhaps, with that cryptic message. And when he carried the key, believing it important, she had no choice but to act. Poison is, after all, a weapon often chosen by those who would avoid open quarrel, and Mrs. Price Ridley has never been fond of direct confrontations. The room erupted in protest. Denial, astonishment. Mrs. Price Ridley herself half rose, spluttering, but Miss Marple continued, her voice unyielding though still gentle. "The casket in the Cockerill house contained Mrs. Aldrington's will, yes, but it was placed there deliberately to draw suspicion. What better hiding place than a household already disliked, with a stepmother eager to suppress scandal? Yet the letters that accompanied it told another tale, one of debts and dealings that tied back, not to Mrs. Cockerill, but to Mrs. Price Ridley. She feared Penrose would reveal her misappropriations, small sums perhaps, but significant to her pride. The missing will was a convenient diversion. The true motive was protection of reputation." Colonel Melchett's brows drew together sharply. "Are you saying she poisoned him there at the fete before us all?" Miss Marple inclined her head. Very quietly. A cordial passed to him by a helpful hand, a moment of fluster when the crowd shifted. These things go unnoticed in the bustle of a fete, but human nature betrays itself. From the first, Mrs. Price Ridley has been the loudest to assign blame, the quickest to seize upon Latham, then upon Mrs. Cockerill. That eagerness, Colonel, was the voice of fear. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Lydia's faint sob. Then, with a sudden cry, Mrs. Price Ridley's composure cracked. "He would have ruined me," she burst out, her hands trembling. "All my years, my standing, destroyed over foolish mistakes. I only meant to silence him, to stop him from speaking." Her voice faltered as the enormity of her confession sank in. The room seemed to exhale as Colonel Melchett gave a curt nod to Harper, who stepped forward grimly. Mrs. Bantry, wide-eyed, clutched her husband's arm. Dr. Haydock muttered something about women and poison, and Lydia, pale but relieved, leaned against Miss Marple, who patted her hand gently When the tumult subsided and Mrs. Price Ridley had been taken away, Melchett turned to Miss Marple with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. "Dash it all, Miss Marple, you make it sound so simple. And yet we chased shadows until you laid it plain. Shall never understand how you saw it." Miss Marple smiled her faint, knowing smile. "It is only a matter of human nature, Colonel. People show you what they fear if you watch closely." Mr. Penrose looked to the one who threatened him, and she betrayed herself by speaking too much. "It is always the smallest things, the glances, the whispers, the eagerness to accuse, that reveal the truth." Later, as the village settled uneasily into its accustomed rhythm, Miss Marple returned to her quiet parlour. The brass key lay on her table, no longer mysterious, merely an object caught up in the tangle of human folly. She replaced it in its envelope and set it aside, her knitting once more taking precedence. Outside, children's laughter floated across the green, and the ordinary life of St. Mary Mead resumed. Yet within her thoughts lingered the lesson she knew too well. Beneath the gentlest appearances, behind lace curtains and polished manners, lay envy, fear, and desperation. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was the same everywhere. Tragically weak, predictably flawed, but endlessly revealing to those who watched with patience. And she, with her needles and her quiet eyes, would always watch, would always